on a cold February evening in downtown Calgary, with the kind of wind that comes off the Rockies and reminds you that winter here is not a metaphor. A 45-year-old diesel mechanic named Alec Drummond had exactly one plan: finish the job, get to his truck, and be home before Nina's bedtime. He had been under a commercial HVAC unit in the basement of an office tower on Center Street since 2 in the afternoon, diagnosing a fault that the building manager had described over the phone as probably nothing serious, and that had turned out to be a corroded relay assembly the previous contractor had hidden behind a fresh coat of paint rather than actually fix. The kind of work that tells you everything you need to know about who had through a building before you, and what they thought of the people who would have to live with their choices. By the time Alec packed his tools and rode the service elevator back to street level, it was past 7. Nina's babysitter, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Ogilvy, who lived 3 floors above them in the same building in Inglewood, and whom Nina had decided was the world's foremost authority on board games and hot chocolate, had already sent a photo. Nina in her pajamas, cross-legged on the kitchen floor, working a puzzle with the gravity of someone diffusing something important. The building manager offered to comp him dinner at the hotel next door. Alec had almost declined. He was tired in the specific way that cold concrete floors and low ceilings produce. The exhaustion that settles into the knees and lower back and stays there until a proper shower and 8 hours push it out. But the wind outside hit him through the revolving door like a flat reminder that February in Calgary had opinions, and the hotel lobby had warmth and amber light. He told himself 30 minutes. If you believe that the people who notice the most are the ones most likely to act on what they see, stay until the very last line of this story. Alec Drummond had not always been the kind of man who read rooms. There had been years, his 20s, most of his 30s, when he had moved through the world with the comfortable inattention of someone who had never been given a particular reason to pay close attention. He had grown up in Red Deer, the middle of 3 brothers, in a house where problems were solved loudly, and feelings were addressed by getting on with things. He had gone into trades straight out of high school because it made sense. He was good with his hands and better at understanding how mechanical systems worked than he would ever be at describing the experience in language someone else found useful. And the trades in Alberta in those years paid well enough to build something real on. He had met Joanne at a friend's Canada Day party at Sylvan Lake, married her 4 years later in a backyard ceremony that had been rained on and perfect, and built a life with her that was modest and specific and completely his. She had been a dental hygienist, precise and warm, the kind of person who could diffuse any room's awkwardness within 30 seconds of entering it. They had been trying for a baby for 2 years when Nina arrived, and Joanne had spent the first 3 days crying with a relief so complete it had no room in it for self-consciousness. Joanne died of an aneurysm on a Thursday morning 4 years ago. Nina had been 3, Alec had been 41. He did not talk about that period very often, not because it was forbidden, but because there was no language that fit it properly. The years since had been the slow process of building a life around a shape that was no longer there. He had moved them to Calgary for the steadier work, and had made a home in Inglewood that was small and functional, and covered in Nina's drawings taped to the refrigerator. She was 7 now, dark-haired and deliberate, with the kind of questions at breakfast that stopped you mid-sip. She was the reason Alec got out of bed every morning, and the reason he had, over the past month, been quietly researching a job listing that had appeared through a trades referral network. The position was Senior Maintenance and Facilities Coordinator at a logistic technology company called Leclerc Supply Systems, a company that had grown fast enough in 4 years to need someone who could manage the physical infrastructure of 3 regional warehouses and 2 office locations across Alberta. The salary was real. The benefits included dental, which Nina's mouth required, with the regularity of a subscription service. Alec had applied with the careful, deliberate preparation of someone who understood that the one variable he could actually control was how ready he was. He had the interview tomorrow morning. He was not thinking about any of this when he noticed her. It happened the way things happen in peripheral vision, not a decision to look, but the body registering something that the attention then turns to address. A woman at a corner booth, seated across from an older man, moving with the particular quality of someone trying very hard not to show that something was wrong. She was dressed professionally, dark blazer, hair pinned back, with the composed posture of someone who had trained themselves to hold a certain shape under pressure. The man across from her was in his late 60s, in the way that certain men of a particular kind are in their late 60s. The expensive watch, the ease of someone accustomed to the space his presence took up, the settled confidence of a person for whom the word no had arrived, so infrequently it had become mostly theoretical. Alec registered the woman's smile first. It was technically correct in every visible way and completely disconnected from whatever her eyes were doing. He had seen that specific combination before, not in hotel restaurants, but on job sites, in meetings where someone had to remain polite to a client who was difficult in the way that comes with a contract. It was the expression of someone doing performance work on top of actual work and spending real energy on both. The man, he would later learn his name was Murray Croft, reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She redirected, adjusted her glass, shifted her elbow, accomplished the removal of her hand without anything that could technically be called a refusal. It was so practiced and precise that Alec understood, in the clear and uncomfortable way of watching someone demonstrate an exhausting skill, that she had done this before, many times. He looked at his coffee. He told himself it wasn't his situation, that he was a mechanic from Inglewood who had finished a job and was waiting out the cold, not a person with any standing in someone else's evening. Then he reached into the front pocket of his jacket. He always kept it there now, folded twice, and looked at the drawing Nina had given him last week. A man and a small girl standing in front of a truck, both of them with the orange crayon hair she always gave them. The truck 3 times too large and joyful looking in the way that 7-year-olds render machines. She had written Dad plus Nina at the bottom in the careful block letters she was still mastering. He looked at it for a long moment. He thought about Nina growing up in a world that had not changed in the ways it should have. He thought about what he would hope someone would do in a restaurant in some city she was navigating as an adult. If she ever sat across from someone like Murray Croft and had to manage it alone. He folded the drawing, put it back in his pocket, and stood up. He crossed the restaurant without urgency, the way a person moves when they belong somewhere, and are simply arriving at the part of the evening they had already planned. He came to the booth and placed one hand lightly on the back of the seat beside the woman. On the seat, not on her, and looked at her with the most ordinary expression he could produce. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "Parking was a nightmare." The words were unremarkable. The timing was everything. For one unguarded moment, the woman looked up at him with an expression that had nothing performed about it. Startled, raw, and underneath both of those things, something that might have been relief. Murray Croft looked up with the specific annoyance of a man whose evening had been interrupted by someone who had no right to do so. He asked, with the particular authority of someone accustomed to controlling the shape of rooms, who exactly Alec was. Alec held his gaze with the steadiness that communicated neither aggression nor apology, and said he was an old friend, that he and the woman went back years, and that he was sorry to interrupt, but they had somewhere they needed to be. He said it with the flat certainty of someone describing a fact rather than constructing one. Murray Croft held the gaze for 3 seconds, the assessment in his expression visible and unhurried. Alec held it back. The woman made her decision. She looked up at Alec and said, "I completely lost track of time. in a voice so composed that he almost believed the story himself. She excused herself from the table with a poise that left Murray Croft nothing specific to object to, and walked with Alec toward the lobby in the unhurried way of two people who had known each other long enough to be comfortable in silence. Neither of them spoke until they were through the main doors and out into the cold. February in Calgary at 8 o'clock is the kind of cold that simplifies things. The city lights reflected off the cleared pavement, and the air had the particular clarity that extreme cold produces, sharp and honest in a way that indoor air rarely manages. They stood under the hotel canopy, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Not from awkwardness, but from the specific relief of a performance ending and a person being allowed to simply breathe. The woman took one slow breath, then another. Alec stood with his hands in the pockets of his work jacket and looked at the street, giving her space to gather herself without watching her do it. "Thank you," she said finally. Her voice was different out here, quieter, less calibrated, still composed, but with something more genuine underneath it. "You didn't have to do that." Alec shrugged, a small movement. "Seemed like you needed it." She looked at him directly then, with the attentive stillness of someone who was used to reading people quickly. He returned it without deflection, and neither of them looked away for a moment that lasted slightly longer than politeness required. She asked if he had done something like that before. He thought about it honestly before answering. He said no, not exactly. She said he was good at it, that the story had almost held entirely on her end because his delivery had been so completely unremarkable. He said she was better at it than he was, that if she hadn't moved with him in the first 3 seconds, the whole thing would have fallen apart before it started. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. The thing a smile becomes in a person who has stopped performing and momentarily forgotten to guard against the real version. A city bus passed on the street. The wind eased briefly, then returned. Alec glanced at his watch, a reflex so unconscious he had already done it before noticing. She caught it. He told her it wasn't a problem, that he was just thinking about his daughter. He said the word the way he always said it, with the ease of something that is simply the central fact of your life, requiring no particular emphasis because it is already everywhere. She heard it. He could see her register the information the way you register, something that quietly reclassifies everything that came before it. They did not exchange names. They did not exchange numbers. It was in its way the most honest conversation either of them had had with a stranger in longer than they could immediately account for, and the boundary of it was understood by both without any need to name it. Some moments are complete in themselves. To reach past them into something more structured would change what they were. She said she would be fine from here. She said it with the directness of someone who meant it, and he could hear that she meant it. She thanked him a second time, and the second thank you carried something the first one hadn't. A specific weight, a gratitude that was personal rather than polite. They walked in opposite directions. Alec turned up the collar of his jacket against the wind. Behind him, he didn't look back. She stood under the canopy for a moment after he had rounded the corner, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the specific and nameless quality of having been helped by someone who wanted nothing from her in return. By the time Alec got back to Inglewood, Nina was asleep. Mrs. Ogilvy reported that the puzzle had been finished, that supper had been eaten with the focused efficiency of a child who understood the relationship between clean plates and dessert, and that the bedtime transition had proceeded without incident, which Mrs. Ogilvy noted was not something to take for granted. Alec stood in the doorway of Nina's room longer than was necessary. She was on her side, one arm around the stuffed beaver she'd had since she was 2, hair across the pillow in the way Joanne's had looked in the mornings. He crossed the room quietly and pulled the blanket to her shoulder. He made tea he didn't finish, sat at the kitchen table with the folder he had been building for 2 weeks. Printed notes about the role, research on the company, a single-page resume that represented 16 years of practical expertise without a university credential, and reviewed everything until he knew it better than he needed to. Preparation was the one variable he could always control. He had been reading the company's public profile carefully, its growth history, the problems it was solving in Alberta's logistics infrastructure, the operational model. The founder was referenced in most pieces by title rather than full name. The one photograph he had found was small and not particularly detailed. He had formed a mental image of the company's leadership that was mostly composed of words. The company was called Leclerc Supply Systems. He had not, as he closed the folder and set it by the door, thought about the hotel. He had not thought about the woman. He was at the address on the interview confirmation by 8:45 the next morning. He had pressed his dress clothes the night before. Charcoal trousers, a dark jacket over a button-up, the clothes he wore when he needed to be professional, without pretending to be something he was not. His boots were polished. His father had told him once, years ago in Red Deer, that the condition of the things other people wouldn't notice told you something true about how you handled everything else. Leclerc Supply Systems occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in the east core of downtown, the kind of building that communicated serious ambition without overcorrecting into pretension. The lobby was clean and purposeful, a company that had grown fast enough to have real design intentions but hadn't forgotten that its core work involved moving physical things through physical space. Alec signed in, took a seat in the waiting area, and looked over the first page of his notes, not because he needed to, but because the words were familiar enough now to be a form of steadiness rather than information. He was 5 minutes early, which was exactly what he considered the appropriate margin. He was looking at the room with the particular attention he gave unfamiliar rooms when he caught the name from the corner of his eye. Engraved on a panel beside the elevator bank, Simone Leclerc, Chief Executive Officer. He read it once, then he read it again. The way you reread something that is correct in every letter, and still takes a moment to assemble into a meaning you had not anticipated. He sat with it, not with panic, not with calculation, with the careful, quiet assessment of a man who had spent 16 years diagnosing systems under time pressure and had learned that the first seconds after an unexpected finding were best used understanding it rather than reacting to it. He thought about what it meant. He thought about whether it changed anything. He was still thinking when the elevator opened. She came through the lobby already in motion, a leather portfolio under one arm, a conversation being concluded with someone behind her. Dark blazer, hair pinned back, every element of her bearing deliberate and practiced in the way that was visible from across a room. She turned toward the waiting area. Her gaze moved across it with the fast assessing sweep of someone accustomed to reading spaces quickly. And then the sweep stopped. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Alec counted them without intending to. He held her gaze with the same steadiness he had held it on the sidewalk the night before. Not defiant, not apologetic, present. He watched her process it. Recognition, then a rapid sequence of assessments moving across her face with the speed of someone who was very good at thinking under pressure. What he saw in those 4 seconds was the moment when a structure encounters an unexpected load and has to decide how to bear it. Everything held, but nothing was quite the same as it had been 5 seconds earlier. Her expression settled into a deliberate professional neutrality. She crossed the lobby and extended her hand. Alec Drummond. "That's me," he said. He stood and shook her hand. Neither of them acknowledged anything beyond those words. The mutual understanding required no confirmation. They both knew what they both knew, and they had both, in the same instant, decided to proceed on the terms of the room they were actually in. She led him to a boardroom on the third floor where two people were already seated. Helen Trask, the company's head of operations, with a decade of precision in her posture and a notepad already open, and a man from the finance side named Paul Doucette, who had the measured neutrality of someone more comfortable with numbers than with the less quantifiable things. Simone took her seat at the head of the table, opened her portfolio, glanced once at the single page that was Alec's resume, and set it face down. Then she looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who had decided to see something clearly and said, "Let's begin." She did not open with the questions Alec had prepared for. She folded her hands on the table and asked, without preamble, "Tell me about a time when you saw something that needed to be fixed, but technically wasn't your responsibility to fix." Alec did not answer immediately. He had learned, over 16 years of working on systems where a wrong call could mean a live line or a failed bearing, that the space between a question and an answer was where the actual thinking happened. He let it sit for a moment. Then he said that in his experience, the responsibility question was usually the wrong question. That if you could see something and do something about it, the job description didn't change what was in front of you. He said he had walked past things that weren't on his work order before and had learned that the cost of doing so, not immediately, but eventually, was always higher than the cost of stopping. Helen Trask made a note. The next question asked him to walk through a time when he had made a call under pressure with incomplete information. He described a specific incident, a heating system failure at a cold storage facility outside the city on a January night, 3 possible causes, and no way to confirm which one before he had to choose. He walked through what he had known, what he had guessed, what he had prioritized, and what had happened. He did not frame the outcome as a success. He described it as the best decision available with what he'd had. The distinction was not lost on anyone in the room. Simone's questions continued in that manner, not hypotheticals with clean edges, but questions that pressed into the texture of actual experience. How had he managed a contractor delivering late against a hard deadline? How had he handled a disagreement with a site manager who outranked him but was wrong? Alec answered each one the same way he had answered the first, directly, without inflation or minimization, attributing outcomes to the people who had genuinely contributed to them and mistakes to the decisions he had actually made. He did not dress his answers in vocabulary designed to sound fluent in a language he had not spoken. He was simply accurate, and accuracy in an interview room is rarer than almost any credential on paper. Paul Doucette asked, toward the end, with the specific neutrality of a challenge dressed as a question, whether Alec had concerns about managing people in the role who held formal engineering degrees he himself did not. Alec looked at him without changing his expression and said the more relevant question was probably whether he had the experience and judgment to do the job well. He said that on both of those he was comfortable letting his record stand. He said it without apology and without heat, with the confidence of someone who had thought carefully about this before and arrived at a conclusion he was at peace with. Doucette held the gaze for a moment, then looked at his notes. Simone gave him a scenario drawn from a real operational problem the company had faced the previous year. A distribution center expansion stalled because the facility's infrastructure hadn't been designed for the load the technology team had spec'd. She laid out the constraints and watched him work through it. He asked 2 clarifying questions, then moved through the logic steadily, naming a solution that required acknowledging a decision already made was wrong and starting part of the process over. It was not the answer she had expected. It was the better one. She did not let what she recognized show on her face. She thanked him for his time, said they were considering several candidates, and told him he would hear by the end of the week. He nodded, shook hands around the table, and left with the same composure he had brought in. The door closed. Helen Trask looked at Simone and said, He's the one. Simone looked at the closed door for a moment and said nothing. That afternoon, the call from the board was not easy. Murray Croft had reviewed the candidate pool with the focused attention of a man who believed his role included influencing processes that were technically not his to run. He had a preferred candidate, a man named Brandon Whitcomb, an engineering degree from Queens, a prior position at a company the board could reference with satisfaction, the kind of resume that moved efficiently through institutional filters. Croft presented his case with the assurance of someone who had been right by default for long enough that he had stopped distinguishing between confidence and correctness. Simone listened. She had learned that listening completely was both the respectful thing and the thing that gave you the clearest picture of where an argument was actually weak. She let Croft finish, then asked several specific questions about Whitcomb's direct field experience, which turned out, under the pressure of specific questions, to be considerably thinner than the resume suggested. She noted this without dwelling on it, said she would finalize her evaluation, and ended the call. She sat at her desk for a long time after. She was not uncertain about her own judgment. She had made enough decisions under enough pressure to know when her assessment was solid. What she was sitting with was the familiar and unwelcome weight of having to defend a correct decision to people who preferred a comfortable one. She allowed herself, in the quiet of her office, to think about the previous evening. She thought about the hotel lobby and the February cold and the particular quality of the conversation on the sidewalk. Its brevity, its honesty, the way the man beside her had given her room to breathe without requiring anything in return for having done it. She thought about what she had been arguing with the board for months. That the company needed people who could actually do the things the roles required, rather than people who could describe themselves compellingly as the type of person who could. Alec Drummond had walked into her boardroom and done exactly what she had been trying to articulate. He had been precisely what he was, without performance or apology, and in doing so, had been more convincing than any credential. She picked up a pen and wrote 2 names on a page. She sat with them. Then she crossed one out. She called Helen Trask first. Helen was heading home, road noise in the background, but answered with the same full attention she always gave regardless of hour. Simone told her the decision. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, "I think that's right. The more I review my notes, the wider the gap between them gets." The call to Murray Croft was short. Simone presented her analysis. Not a defense, which would have been the wrong framing, but a structured case laying out the operational requirements of the role and the evidence from each candidate's interview that mapped or failed to map against them. Croft raised 2 objections. She had anticipated both and addressed them without raising her voice or conceding any ground. He said he would consider it. She thanked him and ended the call. She did not know whether the board would continue to resist. That was a variable outside her control. What was within her control was the quality of the decision itself, and on that she was settled. Alec received the call on a Thursday morning, standing in the parking lot of Nina's school, having just watched his daughter disappear through the front doors with the particular energy of a child who knows exactly where she is supposed to be and is fully in agreement with the arrangement. His phone showed the company's main line. He answered with the calm of someone who had already made his peace over the 2 days since the interview with every possible outcome. The offer was real. A title. A salary that meant something genuinely different from what he had been earning, not a marginal improvement but a real one. Benefits that covered both of them. The kind of stability he had been describing to himself as the goal for 4 years without being entirely certain it was reachable. He sat in his truck for a while after the call ended. The school parking lot emptied around him with the complete indifference of a city that did not know what had just shifted for one person inside a parked half-ton on a cold Thursday morning. He did not allow himself to think too much about who had made the decision or why. He had set that boundary the moment he walked out of the boardroom. The interview had been what it was. He had answered everything honestly. The outcome belonged to the process. He believed that, and the belief mattered to him in a way that was connected to the same instinct that had made him stand up and cross a hotel restaurant the evening before. His first week at Leclerc Supply Systems had the texture that all first weeks have: the ID badge, the desk not yet broken in, the names that required more than one morning to hold. He moved through it with the steady attention he brought to every unfamiliar system, asking the right questions, offering nothing unnecessary, learning the specific shape of this company's operations the way he learned any system, from the inside out. He saw Simone in the hallway on his second day. She was moving in the opposite direction, portfolio under her arm, a problem already forming in her expression before she had reached the next door. She said good morning and used his name, and he returned the greeting with her title, and they continued in their respective directions. It was, on the surface, entirely unremarkable, and yet both of them were aware, in that brief crossing, of everything the corridor didn't know, of the history that had preceded it, and of the specific, deliberate choice that the professionalism of the exchange represented. The conversation that mattered happened at the end of his third week, on a Friday evening when the office had cleared out, and Alec was still at his workstation working through infrastructure assessments for a warehouse expansion that was running behind. He heard footsteps and looked up. Simone Leclerc stood in the doorway. She had the look of someone who had decided to do something that her own discipline had been quietly deferring. She came in and sat across from him in the direct way of someone who had something to say and no interest in approaching it sideways. Alec set down his pen. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." He said that was the only kind he had. She said, "If you had known who I was that night, who I was, what this company was, that I was going to be your interviewer the next morning, what would you have done?" She asked it with the steady care of someone who had been sitting with the question for 3 weeks and was genuinely prepared for whatever came back. Alec was quiet for a moment. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about the hotel restaurant and the February cold and Nina's drawing folded in his jacket pocket. Then he said the same thing. 3 words, no qualifying language, no cushion, no elaboration, just the full weight of his certainty behind them. Simone looked at him for a long moment, then she said quietly, "I know." She said it in the way that meant she had known for 3 weeks, that his answer was not a surprise, but that hearing it said aloud confirmed something that had been living in her chest in the shape of a hypothesis. She nodded once, with the particular manner of someone who has just received information that changes something fundamental in how they understand the world. She said good night and left. Alec sat for a while after that, in the quiet of the empty office, with the warehouse assessments in front of him. Then he picked up his pen and went back to work. What came after was gradual and real in the way that things built on honest foundations tend to be. They worked together for months before they became friends in the full sense of that word. They were friends for longer before anything else began to take shape. There was no single moment that announced itself. There was instead the slow accumulation of small things. A coffee left on his desk without explanation, a mechanical problem she thought to ask him about. Before she called the contractor, an afternoon when Nina's school was canceled for a storm day, and Simone spent 40 minutes on the office floor helping her build a paper bridge that was structurally sound enough to hold a stapler. That last part mattered more than either of them said out loud. What had been clear from the beginning was the quality of what it was built on. Alec had crossed a hotel restaurant and helped a stranger without knowing who she was, without calculating what was in it for him, without the safety net of anticipated gratitude. He had done it because Nina was asleep in Inglewood, because he was trying to build a life that was worth teaching from, because the alternative, the deliberate not seeing, the practiced inaction, was simply not something he was capable of. That was the whole story. And it was also, in some ways, the only story. Kindness is not a strategy. That is precisely what makes it mean something. The moment it becomes calculation, it becomes something else entirely. A transaction wearing a different name. Alec Drummond had not been strategic on a Tuesday night in February, and the fact that it returned to him. In stability for his daughter, in work that fit the actual shape of his abilities, in a person who had genuine reason to see clearly what he was not a lesson about playing things carefully. It was something quieter than that. It was just what happens, sometimes, in a world where most of the connections remain invisible until they don't. The last image is a simple one. It is a Thursday afternoon in April, the kind of afternoon that arrives in Calgary after a long winter and feels like evidence that spring has finally won the argument. Alec is at the gate of Nina's school, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the doors. Nina comes through the crowd of exiting children with the full-body joy of a 7-year-old who has had a good day and is about to see her father. She spots him and starts to run, the completely unself-conscious sprint of a child for whom joy and motion are still the same thing. Alec crouches to catch her. Across the street, stepping out of a car she has just arrived in, Simone Leclerc sees the moment without having looked for it. A man and a small girl, the girl mid-air, the man's arms already open and certain. She watches for exactly as long as it takes for something to settle in her chest, something she doesn't immediately reach for a name for. Then she turns, crosses the street, and walks toward the building, carrying it quietly with her. The way certain things are best carried. Without announcement. Simply present and known and real.